2 weeks ago, we posted an episode where I interviewed two Christian theologians, one Palestinian, one American, about this question: what does it mean to be Christian after the desolation of Gaza? That was a long episode, an hour and a half. Had lots to say, lots for us to chew on, think about. If you have not listened to that episode, you should go back and listen to that one as well. It would be part one. It's with Bruce Fisk and Daniel Bonora. In this episode, I told you that we were going to invite a response from Robert Nicholson, who has spent most of his life studying the Middle East. He spent much of his time in the Middle East with Jordanians and Israelis and Palestinians. He has sponsored research by all of those people. He has been in the room with a lot of the movers and shakers on both the Palestinian and Israeli side of these big policy and political decisions. So he knows of which he speaks. He is going to bring a different perspective, but also bring some of the history of this conflict, maybe things that most Americans aren't aware of, or how things work in the Middle East. At some various points, he's going to have some direct pushback from our guest in the first episode, and I'm sure they would have some direct pushback for him as well. But here at the Center for Hebraic Thought, the Biblical Mind podcast, we believe it's good to gain multiple perspectives. So lest we become too narrowly dogmatic and narrow-minded in our thinking. And again, if I invited 20 more guests from the Middle East on this topic, we would get 20 more perspectives, and none of them would overlap perfectly. So these are just two of many that we could share. If you appreciate conversations like these, even difficult conversations, please give us a like or follow, or you can give us a rating at your favorite podcast outlet. As well, another call out: if you have some design skills, we need a little help with some simple design projects that we could probably do ourselves, but we want them to look better than what we would create. So you can email us at our contact page at thebiblicalmind.org. And if you want to give, you can give at thebiblicalmind.org/give. Now to this episode.
This is the Biblical Mind podcast, produced by the Center for Hebraic Thought. Honest 5-star reviews help others find this podcast. Visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org for articles and videos that explore the deep structures of Scripture.
Well, thank you, Dru. It's great to be on the Biblical Mind, and appreciate the invitation to talk about this new book. I should say I have not yet read this book. I did, however, hear the conversation that you did with the two authors, and I think it's a good place to start. What here is worth thinking about? I would say two things that to me are related. The first one is that the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, whatever we're calling it this week, is the kind of conflict that deserves serious thought, and ideally serious theological thought. It seems that what these two authors are trying to do is to say, that big conflict you've heard about in and around Jerusalem? Well, there are layers to that conflict that make it unique among conflicts, and we should be thinking about and talking about those layers. And I agree with that very much. Related to that is the second point, which is that there are, in fact, Christians in the Holy Land. I don't think it's as unknown maybe as the authors explained, but to the extent there are brothers and sisters in Christ living in the Holy Land, whether they identify as Israeli or Palestinian, whether as Jews or as Arabs, we should care about them. I think it was no less than Jesus himself who said, by this shall all men know that you are my disciples, that you love one another. And I think that we as Christians not just should, but must. We have an obligation to care about other Christians in whatever state that they're in. Obviously, not only in this part of the world, it could be also in China and India, or wherever they may be. But I think that it's very easy for all of us, not even just those of us living in the West, to live in isolation and just think that we are, our community, our denomination, my city is really the only part of Christendom that matters. And of course, that's not true. So I appreciate those Palestinian Christians, including one of the authors, who are out there saying that, hey, we exist. We are a people, and we have things to say.
Yeah, he made the point as well that there's recently been this, hey, we have Christian brothers and sisters in Nigeria, of course, and in Gaza, Gaza, because there's a bomb dropped next to a church in Gaza. And so that, but he also wanted to make the point, but if you just stop there with these are Christian brothers and sisters, that's not going far enough because you're not dealing with the Islamophobia and the kind of anti-Arab sentiment in the West. How do you see that?
Well, I partially agree and partially disagree. I think that in general, I heard a lot of caricatures, a lot of straw men, right? I don't know who these people are that um, the authors are referring to when they make it sound like there are these, hordes of American Christians, Western Christians who are either totally oblivious to these things or are filled with all of this, hate and rage, and that hate and rage is driving their finger at the voting booth and the policies of the country. I mean, it's there's quite a lot of steps to get from, where they say most American Christians are at and where, the conflict is at or where the world is at. There are a number of links in that causal chain that I would dispute. And I think that, American Christians are Islamophobic. It doesn't hold weight in my personal experience. I think there are genuine, objective reasons that Americans are concerned about Islamic terrorism. I don't feel like anybody really needs to defend that statement. I really don't even know what to say about it. It's not as if any concern about Muslims is invented. I mean, there are genuine national security concerns that are rooted in some of these radical groups. Having said that, I think that it is true that American Christians don't live in the Middle East. I mean, look, I studied the Middle East. I've got degrees in Middle East stuff, but it's not until you go there and spend a lot of time there, not as a tourist, but going into people's homes and just kind of walking around that you really get a sense for who all of these people are. And even when it comes to Muslims, right? Which different kinds of Muslims, different,
Mhm.
flavors or levels of intensity, however you want to put it. So I think there's some accuracy in the fact that most American Christians have not been to Israel, have not been to the West Bank, have not been to Gaza, not traveled the region. I don't think that's their fault, but to the extent that the authors are trying to make a corrective, I suppose that's helpful.
Yeah, so that it's interesting you bring up that that's not your experience of the American church. That's the way I feel as well. But I also think, well, maybe I'm just in the weird part of the American church, or maybe I gravitate towards the part that is not, shouting down Muslims because they're Muslims or something like that. I mean, is there data on these things that we could put to this, or where would we look to see whether, again, because the nature of these kinds of discussions is we do have to make generalizations, and the temptation is to turn the generalization into caricature. And so I wonder, for you, what are the kind of solid points of data that make you think here's where the issues actually are when it comes to the church in the Middle East?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think there is one, I don't have anything in front of me here, but there is a study that's been done by the Pew Forum. They've done it at least once, maybe more than once, where they actually break down attitudes of American subcultures
Mm,
towards other subcultures, right? So, what do American evangelicals think about Jews? What do they think about Muslims? What do Mormons think about
mm.
evangelicals? It's a sort of X and Y axis, and it shows you, generally speaking, based on their surveys, where people are at about these different groups. To be fair to the authors of this book, I don't think American evangelicals are rating Muslims super high. Um, Conversely, I'm pretty sure American Muslims are not way, putting American evangelicals super high either, right? So
Right.
I would say that data is important. It's important to know what's actually true, as best as, scientists are able to determine, but it's also important to foreground in all of these conversations. This is the way I approach it. Um, the reality that the vast majority of people in the vast majority of the world are pretty much ignorant about people who are not them. And by the way,
Mm,
that goes for Palestinian Christians as much as you or I. Meaning,
yeah.
if I'm traveling in Ramallah, or I mean, pick another place. If I'm traveling in Addis Ababa, it'd be foolish for me to walk around thinking that these people know who I am and they understand where I'm from and what I think. I mean, they know what they see on TV.
Right.
They pick up things in conversation, and I think, there's a great saying in the Mishnah. So, I can do this because this is,
Yeah.
Center for
Center
Hebrew
for Break
Thought.
Thought. Yeah.
Dan et kol ha'adam, lechaf zechut, which is I think it's attributed to Yoshua ben Prachia, which is to say, judge every man with the scales weighed in his favor. And I try to do that with other people. I don't always succeed, and I just hope that everybody can kind of do the same, as well.
Yeah. And to their point and your point, being on the ground and knowing people does make a difference. And in fact, we've seen this with the World Cup. The New York Times podcast just did an entire episode
Yeah,
on all these people who travel to America and have been
I
shocked
love it.
by
I
how
love it.
Americans are, right? And in a good way. And in fact, I was seeing this on my own social media feeds. Of course, I have a Scottish algorithm in there as well because I lived in Scotland twice. But these Scots going and Australians just going like, hey, people back home, we have been lied to.
Man,
These people are great, and of course everybody's on their best behavior, but they're kind of seeing the best of America. And I feel like that's my experience when I travel in Palestinian territories and Israel as well, is that people on the whole are pretty great and don't have a lot of animosity. Although there is some very focused animosity. Maybe we should talk about, there's that great YouTube channel, and I forget what it's called. It's got its problems, but he just goes around and asks people questions sent to him by viewers on the streets in the West Bank and in Israel, and he just asked them, like, if you could destroy all the Palestinians today with a push of a button, would you? And of course, this is before October 7th. Most Israelis said no, of course I wouldn't, right? And most Palestinians said no, of course I wouldn't, right? So I guess the question is, you hear stats on what people think, even things like in the West Bank, I think it was the Pew poll that said you still had a high degree of favorability towards Hamas, even 2 years later. But, the people I've talked to from Gaza say, well, yeah, they've never lived under Hamas. So, like, what do they got to lose by supporting it? And then I've heard other people say, well, yeah, but they think Hamas only attacked military target. So maybe help us figure out like the complexities of even saying this is what people believe on the ground.
my experience is that people talking about Palestinians and the Palestinian cause, well, again, are quite ignorant about what Palestinians themselves are thinking. They're talking about the different disagreements that they have and all of that. So you're hitting on that here.
Not the authors
And
of this book that we're talking about, but
right, but just in general, I'm talking about
yeah.
people who have podcasts like this one will sit, whether I don't know whether they're Christian or not Christian, just people who are weighing in with opinions on this conflict usually don't look under the hood. Let's say less frequently
Hmm.
than you would hope.
Hmm.
And you're pointing to Palestinian polls, which I consume rather religiously. I'm always curious, what are Palestinians actually thinking about right now? And
Hmm.
thankfully, such data is available. And you're right that Palestinians in the West Bank, not only, but Palestinians in the West Bank are still showing a lot of favor for Hamas. And I think it's not it's not surprising given where things were at on October 6th, 2023. Palestinians for years and years, as tracked by publicly available uh, opinion surveys, were showing deep frustration at their situation, right?
Hmm.
More and more and more and more. In the years that I've been working on this, it just steadily deteriorated, right? And it was largely frustration directed toward, yes, the conflict and the Zionists, but also at their own leaders, right?
Hmm.
All their parties kind of were called into question. Their president is famously one of the most unpopular Palestinians in Palestine. And Hamas originally wasn't getting great ratings, but over time, that frustration, there was one question on those surveys that where you could see this thing coming out, which was, I'm going to paraphrase it. I can't remember exactly how they framed it, but they basically asked Palestinians, "What do you think is the best way to get what we as Palestinians need?" And they would, sort of like peaceful, nonviolence, international diplomacy, uh, armed struggle, right? And the support for the armed struggle before October 7th was growing and growing and growing, even among
Mm.
people I know, right? There was a feeling that we're not getting what we want. This whole thing isn't working. Nobody's listening to us. We kind of have to do what we have to do. And I think that Hamas scored a lot of points among people who otherwise would not have considered supporting Hamas
Mm.
because, yeah, they're SOBs, but they're our SOBs, and they actually got something done. Like they
Right.
forced Israel to act. They forced the United States. They forced the whole world to remember that we exist. And don't forget, Palestinians at that point were feeling extremely overlooked, right? Because Israel's making peace with other
Right.
Arab states, this whole Abraham Accords thing, and they felt that the world had moved on. But what about us, right? And so I think that you do find, unfortunately, a surprising amount of support for the core ideology of Hamas, right? That sort of radical, apocalyptic Islamic thing. But you also find all of these people who are not necessarily wired for that, but look at these people as freedom fighters. And by the way, if you say, well, isn't your sort of secular moderate leadership, the current president and the Palestinian parliament, isn't that a better alternative? It's very likely that they will turn to you and say, okay, fine, but what have they done?
Right.
What steps have they taken to improve our situation? And that desperation, I think, has fed so much of this and is still very present on the street in the West Bank and Gaza.
Yeah, and so that building frustration, and I'm glad you pointed out the Palestinian leadership because I think that's pretty renowned. Even people who only know a little know that the corruption of the Palestinian leadership or the inabilities of the Palestinian leadership has been a sore point for Palestinians for a long time now. Um, but if we think in terms of this growing popularity of anybody who will do something, what's the other option from Israel's side? I guess, what could Israel have done to relieve the pressure here? Granted that assuming Israel is not gonna change all of their protocols and policies overnight, but what do you think would be and you can feel free to speculate here. Maybe if they had done X, Y, and Z, they could have created some ease for the Palestinians to start living their lives the way they wanted to.
Right. Well,
I know you've got thoughts on this.
I do. I'm trying to think about the most succinct way to give them. So I would say that I think I know what I don't want to speak for them, but let me speculate as to what the authors of this book might say. They would say something like Israel never gave Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, and his government a real chance. Rather than criticize him for what he was not doing, they should have praised him and supported him for what he was doing, meaning trying to provide that, I don't know, middle way, some kind of
Mhm.
secular uh, expression of Palestinian nationalism. And that if Israel, and particularly, everyone's favorite Israeli, Benjamin Netanyahu, had done that, that release valve may have been opened. Hamas would have seemed less attractive as an alternative. And one thing would lead to another, and inch by inch, we would kind of get closer to peace, right? This vision of a two-state solution, which in some ways is anachronistic because it's so little supported these days. But
Hmm.
that's probably you know, some version of what someone on the other side might say. I would say also they would say they would block settlements, right? They would either shrink
Right.
them or freeze them. These are Jewish, towns in the West Bank. Things in that vein.
Okay.
Now, having said that, I'll sort of channel the Israeli perspective on this, and then I'm talking now about right, left, and center. This is the vast majority of Israeli Jews, who make up about 80% of the population. 20% or so are Israeli Arabs. Israeli Jews would probably say something like, you know, fine, we were interested in that. That was the whole Oslo peace process that started in
Mhm.
the 90s and continued inch by inch through the various different legal instruments to begin the process of devolving sovereignty over West Bank and Gaza to Palestinians. We worked with Yasser Arafat, Abbas's predecessor, on that. When Arafat died, we continued working on that with Mahmoud Abbas. But this big giant thing happened in the middle, which was this explosion of terrorism in starting in the year 2000 that was called the Second Intifada. And let's assume we have an Israeli peacenik here on the podcast. I'm just gonna do the puppet show here, and that person is pressed and saying, "Well, okay, well, why would the Second Intifada derail a peace process? Right? Peace is good for everyone."
Mhm.
And that peacenik, who probably has become much less of a peacenik over the course of the last 20 years, would say something like, I believed all of it, lock, stock, and barrel, me and all of my friends. But time after time after time, it was clear to us that either the Palestinian people, or at the very least, the Palestinian leadership, the leadership that actually was shaping the events on the Palestinian side, was not only not interested in peace, but was trying its best to torpedo it, primarily through a slew for years of suicide bombings and other just heinous terrorist attacks. And, let me be honest, my right-wing friends turned to me and said, "How's that peace going there, buddy?" And you know what? I have to say they were right.
Mhm.
And that is the experience of so many Israelis, right? There's a way to tell the history of this conflict where you see, um, the Israeli people bringing a hammer down on Palestinians. There's another way to tell it that reveals that image is actually a green screen, and that there is this terrorist or group of terrorists dressed in green who are prompting that hammer to come down, right? And so that Israelis who really, I mean, Israelis just want to be left alone and to live. I can't emphasize that point enough. And that's having met many Israelis. They there's never been an interest in fighting. It's just a small country. There's very few people in Israel, right? Everybody's got to fight. It means my son, my daughter is going to war. People don't have an interest in that, but they do it when it seems that the process of peacemaking has been blocked by, at the very least, spoilers, right, who are killing Jews without discrimination, or at worst, and God forbid we think this, that large portions of Palestinian society actually support that and are not ready for peace. And Jews don't know which is true, and in the meantime feel that they have to defend themselves. And that's how an Israeli would respond
Hmm.
to sort of the point I was making earlier.
Yeah, it's the politics of the street. When bombs are going off in cafes, it's really hard to get a populace to turn towards peace at that point, and that would be true in every situation, right? And so we're kind of thinking about, for lack of a better word, the secular situation, like just the history of the situation here. Um, Bruce did mention, when I asked him to kind of depict how Israelis would think of themselves in this storyline of the history of the region, he went straight to an issue which I don't think is unfair. He said, fear is they're afraid and they see themselves as victims, right? As afraid. I don't know if he used the word victim, but it seemed that he was painting a picture of victimhood. Um, we have two parties, Palestinians and the Israelis, who both have deep fears of the other, and they both kind of perceive themselves as victims in some ways. At least some Israelis do. What happens? I guess what's what good can come of that situation? How do you get people to move off the, yes, we know you have been wronged, but, right? Is that the way forward, or is there some other way that I'm not seeing?
Look, it's always healthier if we all disclose our biases, and I'll name mine right here. I am having studied this conflict ad nauseum, taught it, traveled the region, not just this part, but all over, from one end to the other. I have a particular view about the history, and I do think history matters. It was one of the things that I thought was really lacking in the presentation, that, as I heard it on the podcast. The book may provide something very different, but the history, to the extent it was even mentioned, was so um, sloppy. I would say that it just does it gives you no context for where we are today. My view of the history, and I'll just give you the cliff notes to get to the answer to your question, is that Jews began coming to this land in the 1880s, a little more in the 1890s, a little more in the 1900s, et cetera, et cetera. And they came because they had been convinced by our ancestors, Mr. Dru Johnson, Dr. Dru Johnson, Christians, that they didn't have a place in Europe, that Europe did not want them. They were never going to be equal, whether they, um, abandoned their Judaism or kept it hidden, right? There was always this stigma around them. And at the height of the nationalist movement, when the Scots were becoming Scottish and everybody's, the Greeks are becoming Greek, and the Jews, kind of some percentage of the Jews, a small percentage, looked around and thought, well, what are we, chopped liver?
Mm.
Like, we're also a people. We're one of the oldest recorded and continuously documented peoples in history. Like, why don't we have this? Why have we ever thought about going back to our land and just being normal instead of being these interlopers, these gypsies all over the world? And so they started coming back. And the feeling was, there was actually a deep, and I've studied Hebrew literature from around this time, and I can tell you that I actually wrote a big long paper once called Semites in the Raw,
Hmm.
where I documented the ways in which the first Zionists so romanticized and even idolized the Arabs they found in the land, that they emulated them. They dressed like them, they ate like them, they adopted their language. They were
Hmm.
very much seeing what we call Palestinians now as like what they could have been if only they hadn't been exiled. And so they thought, a Semitic people speaking a Semitic language, living this authentically rooted Semitic life, like, I want to be them. They start riding horses. They're discarding their whole European heritage, stopping speaking Yiddish. And that was the feeling. Not only did they not hate Palestinians, they were really into them. And I mean, you could
Hmm.
just read the sources, right? But and I'll fast forward here. I won't give you a whole history thing, but this basically what happened was, over a period of years, inflection point, first one, of course, being World War One. That whole situation changed, and the Arabs, even those who had been welcoming, began to change. Right? They saw that these Jews are going to keep coming. They really want to live here. They want to speak their language, and the whole culture, the whole society is going to change. And there was a massive reaction against it. 1920, first riots, 1921, 1929, 1936, and slowly over a period of years, starting then, but most recently ending in October 7th, 2023, more and more and more and more Jewish um, settlers, you could say, living in this land, realize that, well, we're not welcome here either, right?
Hmm.
The Christians here, the Muslims here, they also don't want us, right? So nobody wants us. We have nowhere else to go. Ein lanu eretz acheret, right? We don't have another land. This is it. This is the last stop. So we have to protect ourselves. And there were many attempts to try to make peace, to try to talk with the Arabs, states around them. Some of them more open than others, notably the Kingdom of Jordan being
Hmm.
at the top of that list. But it was a process, right? So that, now if you walk around the streets of Israel and you ask a Jewish Israeli, questions about Palestinians, the majority will say, no, they just want to kill us. There's no possibility of peace. But it took a long time for them to get there.
Hmm.
And I think that telling history that way is very different from this more generic kind of history that doesn't take into account the psychological factor. Having said that, now I'll give you the other perspective. You could imagine being an Arab, Christian or Muslim, living in the land when all of these Jews are showing up, right? And they're bringing technology, they have money, they have connections in Europe that you don't have, and it's disorienting, right? I mean, it's like, immigration here in the United States. It
Mhm.
it, it freaks people out, and I think that you know, I as much as I see history in the way that I see it, if I want to put myself in the shoes of those Arabs, I can understand, right? They see this as a foreign and maybe hostile element that is trying to subvert its own culture. I think the reaction was entirely out of proportion, mainly because some people on the Arab side hijacked leadership over that situation. But nevertheless, I get it, right? I understand that that was a massive paradigm shift in daily life in
Mhm.
the Ottoman Empire, Palestine. So that's where the fear comes from, right? There's always a fear of what are their intentions. Okay, we let down our guard a little bit. We take a step toward peace. What are they going to do? Are they going to hit us when we're not looking? Or if we do something in good faith, will they do something of good faith? That was happening for a while in the 90s when people
Mhm.
thought things were on track, and it was derailed. And I think, if you ask me what you asked me, like, how do you basically, if I'm hearing you right, you're asking, like, how do you break the cycle?
Right.
I would say that somebody needs a leader. It's a leadership question always. Somebody needs to stand up and break the cycle. And now I'm going to lay the burden at the feet of the seemingly weaker party. And this is very much in the face, I think, of most people who would advocate for the Palestinian side, which is to say that I believe that if a Palestinian leader emerged tomorrow who, didn't not waving the Israeli flag, let's not be silly and superficial about this, but said, listen, mistakes were made on both sides. And we admit that we've got some fault here, but you know what? Tomorrow's a new day, and we are going to begin taking steps, starting with these, three things, concrete things, to show in good faith that we are different. I think the reaction from the Israeli side would be tremendous because there is nothing that Israelis want more than for all of this to just stop or at least calm down, right? They don't need love from Palestinians. They don't need Zionism. They just want to coexist. There are a minority of people, and that minority's grown, who've become
Mhm.
quite militant, right? We see what's happening in the West Bank over the last few months, last few years,
Right.
and those people exist, but they are vastly outnumbered by the rest of Israeli Jews who would love to see that kind of Palestinian leader emerge.
Uh, I tend to believe that story that Israelis would be very, very happy to go in that direction. I can imagine some hesitance, like we've been here before, with various Israeli leaders before who were willing to absorb the shock. Um, how would Palestinian, on the ground, percentage wise, how many Palestinians do you think are actually going to go? Let's assume it's a strong leader who has a clear vision, has a network, has some international help, all the things that you would want in place. How likely do you think that Palestinians are going to be to go along with that and not just, and the more the militant wing of these Palestinian organizations, these jihadist organizations, aren't they just going to derail that again? And aren't Israelis just going to go, "Oh, we tried."
It's a great question. Great question. Because it effectively is the history of, the last 30 years of the
Right.
conflict. Again, weighing the scales in the favor of the Palestinian people. There was I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but a sizable percentage of Palestinians who were very happy that the Oslo peace process was happening and looked forward to the day there would be these two states living at peace side by side and all of that.
Mm.
And of course, it was derailed. I think, and this is where the whole posture of, I think one of the authors of this book talked about himself as a radical pacifist. This is where all of that, something I hear a lot from Palestinian Christian advocates, kind of runs into reality because I'm not a pacifist. I think a pretty nuanced view of how violence, can be understood, thought about from a Christian perspective. We'll put that aside. Suffice it to say that this Palestinian leader we speak of, the man, the man we want, may he be out there even now, right, preparing to emerge onto the stage of history. This person will have to use violence to curtail, degrade, and ultimately stop those people who are hardwired to derail any attempts at peace. Hamas, obviously, first of all, but not only, right? Unfortunately, it's not, 1 or 2% of Palestinians in the streets who support that kind of Palestinian national movement. It's a sizable percentage.
Mm.
And there is going to be a need to gain monopoly of violence over the bad guys in order to kind of put them back in their pen, craft a narrative that bring, a kind of what's the word? What they do? Amnesty.
Oh, yeah.
Amnesty. Like a kind of, put those people back in their pen and extend, create a narrative, create a movement that can accept all of those people who may have previously supported that, but are now ready to turn a new leaf. And that's hard to think about, I think, for many Christians, that the path to peace may first, run through violence. But the only other alternative is for Israelis to stop those people. And of course, everybody on the Palestinian side is very angry at that. Why are Israeli soldiers and police coming into Palestinian villages? And the Palestinian security forces need to uh, increase their cooperation with Israel. They already cooperate with Israel. It's sort of like the dirty little secret of all of this is that there's even now still fairly tight coordination between the IDF and the Palestinian security forces in the West Bank. And that needs to improve, and bad guys need to be stopped, right? It doesn't work if all the good guys have no weapons and the bad guys have them all, right? I'm tempted to say in this part of the world, but I think that's probably in every part of the world, right?
Mm.
It's just the way it is. And I think that that person would need to be strong. They can't be Gandhi. That's not going to work here, right? They need to be a strong leader, um, somebody who has respect in the refugee camps, right? Who has respect among who even among Muslim radicals has respect, known as somebody who's strong and determined and well connected and able to deliver on promises. Right? Such people do exist,
Hmm.
but they're usually not the people brought out front. If that person emerged and Israelis saw, basically, how can I put this? If Israelis saw someone on the Palestinian side who was saying and doing the right things vis-a-vis peace, right? Initiating or reinitiating that process. And this is crucial, was basically dealing with his own spoilers. Israelis would let down their guard promptly, right? That's what they're willing to see. The big critique against the current president of the Palestinian Authority is that while he's certainly better than Hamas, right? He's not out there for the most part advocating, for violence. Although he doesn't do enough to discredit it. He he's always kind of got one foot in that camp, right? And
Mm.
he's tolerated the use of, tax money to fund the families of Palestinian terrorists who are now in prison or who have died, at the hands of Israelis, et cetera, et cetera. Israelis see that and they're like, okay, so you're saying something that sounds good, but in reality, you're like you're tolerating all these bad guys in your camp, and so long as you do, this isn't going to work. So
Yeah.
we need a Palestinian leader who's strong, who's tough, who's willing to deal with those people. And I think, there's this whole idea. Maybe it's Orientalist in nature, but I've seen it borne out in practice. This idea of the strong horse, right? People back the strong horse. Maybe not in the beginning, but someone who comes out and shows themselves strong, who shows himself able to deliver. Suddenly, people who may have, formerly been critics put their criticism away and say, "All right, well, I'll give this guy a try." I
Hmm.
do think that would yield results on both sides of the green line.
So, into that in that vision, peace with Israel is really going to war at home, which is gonna take quite a network, a lot of trust amongst your people. It does seem almost
Hey, let me
impossible.
can
Yeah.
I wanna so the first step is not violent at all, which is crafting a new narrative,
Mm.
right? So what is a post-conflict Palestine? What does it look like? To this day, Drew, and I've been in every room. I've met Mahmoud Abbas. I've was on a WhatsApp texting basis with the former PLO negotiator Saeb Erekat. He's now passed away. I've met Mohammed Shtaye. I've met a lot of people over there. I've spent many times, many hours in these different rooms and listening to. Never once have I heard a affirmative, positive, you know, prosperity-based vision for what a post-peace, post-normalization Palestine would look like. What would it do? How would it grow? What was its economic plan to become the new Singapore? Whatever. I've never ever heard it, ever. And even when I ask a question, well, what happens after?
Hmm.
It's well, we can't get there. The Zionists are in the way. It's like, okay, so I understand you're in the middle of a conflict. It's hard to see, but the first step for that leader, it's not just to, discipline the baddies. It's to tell a new story, right? This isn't all that defines us as Palestinians is that the Jews are mean. Like that can't be the story because if you make peace with the Jews, then who are we? What does it mean to be a Palestinian? What is Palestine contributing to the community of nations? I I think that to me is crucial. It's more important than even the monopoly of violence because you can't even
Mm.
get there if you're not telling a better story. Like inspire us, inspire your people, inspire Israelis, inspire me. I want to be inspired. I'm desperate to be inspired. I have not yet been inspired, sadly. So I
Mm.
think that it's true. There's like a kind of what you said, like a civil war component to it, at least for a little while. But I think with the right leadership and the right narrative, that war may not be as devastating as it sounds.
Hmm. Um, and on Israeli side, do they need a better narrative as well?
I think yes. I think Israelis, it's a very interesting moment, right? You're kind of catching me in the middle of the Copernican revolution and asking me, well,
Right.
what's going to happen tomorrow? It's October 7th was a dramatic change, right? We've talked about some of the trends that were already in place on both sides. This was obviously a huge inflection point. Um, One of the things that has seems to have gone by the wayside for now on the Israeli side is the idea that, look, even with bad guys who are sworn to our destruction based on their nationalism, based on what Allah told them or they think that he told them, even with them, like, we can live. They stay on you stay in your side of the yard or in your yard, I stay in my yard, we'll be fine. That was actually for all of the talk about Benjamin Netanyahu being this, warmonger, the big critique of him in Israel is that he is anything but. He was essentially, I mean, I don't wanna say this too strongly, but he was more or less propping up Hamas in Gaza. Or, like, let's say he was going out of his way to tolerate this Islamic terrorist group controlling this
Hmm.
piece of territory on Israel's border, right? He was working with Qatar to facilitate, financial support for Hamas. He was, every now and then when Hamas would launch a barrage of rockets, he'd tell the IDF, hit them back. That's the way it works. But by and large, the feeling among him and among most Israelis was, look, there's these people in the Middle East who, for their own reasons, are never, ever, ever going to accept us, never going to make peace. It is what it is. We just need to be really good in a technical sense at protecting our borders and making sure that those people stay in their yard. And by the way, for a long time that worked. And functionally, what that meant is that Israel could even live with Hamas,
Hmm.
but Hamas punctured that whole idea so that now Israelis of all kinds, left-wing Israelis, are convinced that we cannot allow these people, at the very least, to be on our borders, but ideally, they should be pushed back as far as possible. And it's why you've seen not only a response to October 7th in Gaza, but also in Lebanon, also in Syria, also in Iran, right? There's this feeling now, it's changed. Israel's not in the mood to just sort of live and let live, because these people, if they have this thing in their hearts, it may sit dormant for a while, but eventually they're going to act on it and they're going to catch us with our pants down and we're going to die. Like our kids, our wives, they're going to die. And so Israelis, are telling themselves a story now that I fear is is it's a bit of a myth, right? The myth being that they can stop this, they can fix it, they can
Hmm.
make sure that these people never again strike them, when they're not expecting it. Because of course it's impossible, right? You can do better, but in some ways these wars, I mean, we're seeing evidence of this. While I'm completely, in principle, in support of what Israel's done since October 7th. I'm not talking about the details. I'm talking about the response Israel made. I don't know how Israel could have had another response. But it's, you know, Benjamin Netanyahu said this. What was the story he was telling after October 7th? We were attacked, in a brutal, grisly fashion, and we are going to strike back and we are going to have total victory.
Hmm.
Total victory. It's not possible, right? And what's going to happen is the disparity between that promise and reality is going to grow and grow, so that until Israelis also become deeply frustrated with their inability to change their situation as it is.
Hmm.
The fact of the matter is, there's a lot of radicalism in this part of the world. People are going to keep hating the Jews, keep trying to destroy Israel. And to some extent, Israelis just need to find a new equilibrium, right? There's not going to be this total victory, sadly.
Hmm.
And you see what's happening in Israel. Just people I know, friends of mine, like they're going. I'll say this and then I'll stop. I know I'm going off here, but I feel some kind of obligation, Drew, to like channel the Israeli perspective, because it's almost always not even talking about your previous guest, but it's become so caricatured and so generic, and it's like nobody actually knows these people.
Hmm.
And the people I know are exhausted, physically exhausted. Years of fighting themselves, their kids, their brothers, their sisters, their cousins, their neighbors, their kids are exhausted, right? And this is after COVID, everything those kids went through during COVID. They feel like everybody hates them now more than ever. Not even just in the Islamic world, now in Europe, and even Donald Trump himself, who they were hoping was going to, defend them from all this. And there's this feeling that they fought and fought and fought. They feel like they're really no better off than they were at the beginning, or
Hmm.
not better off enough to really put an end to this whole thing, and they don't know what to do. They don't know where to turn. The story has hit a dead end for as we're recording this now.
Hmm.
And there is a need for new leadership, I think. There's an election this year. I think Benjamin Netanyahu is misunderstood to a large extent. I actually have a podcast called Hebraica. I have an episode that went up today June 30th, called "BB, Jesus, and Genghis Khan," where I actually try to get into BB's head a bit. I think he's just people think things about BB that are not true. But look, he's been around for a long time, and personally, I think it's time he steps aside. Thank you for your service.
Hmm.
I think the Israeli people, large portions of them feel that way. We'll see what happens at the polls. It's up to Israelis in the end, but I do think that like the same thing on the Israeli side. I think a new leader needs to come out with, a new story and try to move things into the next chapter, right? We can't be in a post October 7th world forever. We need to be in a pre whatever comes next world. And I'm waiting to see who will stand up in Israel to try to outline what that is, what that looks like, what that means, right? And that's it's a difficult thing right now.
Hmm. I think that's very helpful to begin to get our heads around the narratives that are dominating in this part of the world. Let's go pre-October 7th for a second and think about in some ways, the conversation that I had with Daniel Benora and Bruce Fisk, we could have had it before October 7th, and I think the things they were saying, at least in that conversation, would have still been the same. What are the big points of agitation here? I mean, we talk about, I heard the terms occupation, colonialism, genocide, ethnic cleansing, very extreme terms. When I pushed Daniel Benora on, whether Hamas and Israel were really apples to apples comparison, he said, yes, maybe Israel is worse, maybe, but he'll take equal. So why do you suppose, we heard some of the reasons he said that. Why do you think people might think that Israel is, in some ways is colonialist, almost from a Christian view, like a demonic government that is hell-bent on oppressing the people around them?
Well, the real answer, Drew, is I actually don't know the answer to that because I just don't see it that way, like in fundamental terms. But I let me weigh the scales, in that direction. I think that well, there was a couple things that one of your guests said that just frankly kind of shocked me. One was his, at best equating Israel and Hamas, at worst seeming to say, as you just said, Israel's worse, and pretty much like, well, can you blame Hamas? By the way, that's a very common that he's not unrepresentative. That's a very common view. Um,
Like
there
Hamas
was
is
his
just the
character.
natural outgrowth of the
Right,
occupation. Yeah.
right, exactly. Right. You set up shop in my yard, so I go over and kill your wife. Like, well, can you blame me? Yeah, I think I can blame you, actually. There was that. There was the description of Zionism. I mean, it was like every buzzword you can think of. Yeah, colonial, imperial, and Orientalist. Uh, it's just not true. Like historically, just based on text and actual events, Zionism is the movement for Jewish national self-determination in the Jewish homeland. Literally that. People didn't even at the beginning know whether they wanted a country, right? That was litigated for decades until
Hmm.
it became clear that they had to do that in order to protect themselves in the land. There was an ongoing dispute from
Can I
1880
can I double
until
check
the
what you're
20s
saying
and
here?
30s. Sorry?
Sorry. When you say they didn't even, there was a dispute about whether they wanted the nation. You're saying they wanted to be in the homeland. They wanted to have the right to kind of live their lives. The question is whether they needed to establish a nation in order to build an army to do that, and that was litigated.
100%.
That's what you're saying. Okay, just making sure we're on
Correct.
the same page. Okay.
Yeah, and a deep and long-standing ongoing debate between several major camps within Zionism about, well, what's the end goal of this movement? Are we trying to build a state? That came, Theodore Herzl became famous for proposing that, but at best, he didn't come around until 1896, 1895. And that wasn't the stated purpose of the official Zionist movement for years afterward, years afterward. And even then, even when it became, there was still large uh, a large camp that dissented from that and said, no, it became the only conceivable path, right?
Hmm.
That look, we have to defend ourselves. The only way to do that is with arms. The only way to do that was in the structure of some kind of state. So, at the beginning, for decades actually, Zionism was a law-abiding, property-buying movement, right? That proceeded in proportion to the amount of land that Jews coming from Europe could buy in good faith through negotiation and, lots of handshakes and tea, no doubt, with Arab property owners, right? That was actually what happened. Was people think like Israel emerged in 1948 because of the Holocaust? It's just not the history.
Hmm.
So that just that's where the historical thing really kind of bothers me when I hear people just describe it in like these cursory ways. But I think that over time it did. Zionism has has basically been a series of responses to kind of outside influences. Jews have, their main thing is to protect Jews in their homeland, to live a fully authentic Jewish life the way that their ancestors had. But pragmatically, as Arabs did what they did, the British did what they did, et cetera, the movement kind of evolved to fit the circumstances. That's my understanding of the history. But I mean, your question, I mean, I want to make sure I answer the question that you're asking. So maybe, you know, hone it a little more so I don't, give you a full lecture here, Drew.
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate the history. I guess you know, y- even the issue of Zionism, right? That hegemony is required. The issue of Jewish supremacy was raised at the end, and that this is colonialist. And of course, I pushed back and said, like, look, colon- colonialism like goes back to the Arab empires and prior to that as well, right? Like nobody's from this land anymore. Everybody has taken over this land. So where do we start the timeline of colonialism is difficult to say. But that if there is a Jewish supremacy, right? So in the Jewish state today, Zionism has grown into many different things. If it has become something that is hegemonic, that is supremacist, that does create a caste system or a class system of a certain way, in a certain way, uh, intentionally and like institutionally. I mean, I think that issue we didn't get into it, but is it a Jewish supremacist state or is it not?
It's a Jewish state, and guess you could say privileges Jewishness in the same way Ireland privileges Irishness and Italy privileges Italianness, right? You could go to Italy and build your house somewhere and say, "What's your problem? Why are you so focused on Italian pride?" And they would be very justified in telling you, "I'm sorry, Dr. Johnson, this is the state of the Italians. That's kind of why we did this whole thing." And that's Israel. Israel's no different from virtually any other state. By the way, just read the Palestine Basic Law. People never do this because it's too technical, but there is a proto constitution right now. You could go find it online that explains to you exactly what the state of Palestine will be, or if you believe some, is already. And it is an Arab state, a Palestinian state, a a state that privileges Islam and Islamic law, right? And that makes anybody who doesn't fit those different categories by, definition, a second class citizen, one
Hmm.
could say. Personally, I actually don't have a problem with a Palestine that privileges Arab Palestinian identity and that privileges the Arabic language and that privileges the vast majority, like 98% of its inhabitants' religion, which is Islam. Okay, like that's pretty much, what we're doing out here with these nation states. America's this weird outlier. Most countries do that. So if you're talking about the fact that Israelis prioritize Jewishness and Hebrew, and like I don't know why that's even worth talking about. That's pretty normal.
Hmm.
If you're saying that there is a policy within the state of Israel to actively oppress, suppress, minimize, marginalize non-Jews. I don't see that. I do see certain politicians who represent certain parties who talk in those terms, and who, if you gave them the keys to the whole thing, they probably would
Right.
try to
Itamar
set up,
Ben-Gvir being the most famous of
Itamar
them.
Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich, right? These are
Right.
the boogeymen at present. And unfortunately, what the Palestinians have done, and those who support them over the last few years, have only empowered those guys, right? They're just sitting back and kind of pointing to the statements coming out of the Palestinian street, the Arab world, and kind of with a smug look on their face saying, "See, these Palestinians, they're not ready for peace. They're just going to kill us as soon as we let our guard down." Like, if you want to empower the Ben-Gvirs, like, keep doing what you're doing.
Hmm.
That is not the majority of Israelis. That is not the Israeli state as it stands today. I just don't. The big question is the West Bank, right? Let's put aside Gaza because of its, let's say, in flux. We don't know what's happening there or what's going to happen. But the big question is the West Bank. Wither the West Bank. Will it become part of a future Palestinian state, or will it become just another part of one giant state, which is kind of where a lot of Jews are at, and Palestinians, but for very different reasons and with
Hmm.
very different images in mind. To the extent that that zone, the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, as Hebrew speakers call it, is a gray zone, is like this weird thing in international law that isn't that and isn't this. It is a problem, right? The
Mhm.
ongoing murkiness of the West Bank is a huge problem. Questions of rule of law and
Mhm.
who's making the rules, and to what extent are Palestinians calling shots, and where, et cetera, et cetera. That's really the crux of the issue. And if you're talking about that, then you're talking about an Israeli state that's not fully in control, but de facto pretty much in control, with a few exceptions, and trying to protect Jews who are mostly living peacefully, but increasingly, in small but growing numbers, becoming desperate themselves and lashing out at the Palestinians around them. And that's a big issue.
Yeah. And you're talking about some of the settler violence that's going on, among other things, that, as they point out, has always been an issue, but it is increasing right now. Could you just enumerate a few ways in which, if I'm an Arab Israeli, Palestinian, how am I treated differently? Maybe, okay, so the state has no policy against Arab Israelis who are Christian or Muslim. But are there palpable ways in which I would feel that I was being treated differently if I lived in Israel as a Muslim Palestinian or Christian?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, right? So, and some of this is very subjective. I mean, think of yourself living in Italy, right? Maybe
Right.
you don't, maybe you speak some Italian, but not great. You're visibly maybe not like other people. They kind of know that you're part of a minority community of non-Italians who live in the country. You might walk around feeling like these people hate me, right? They don't see me as equal. They don't see me as actually part of the fabric of this country. And in some cases you'd be right, but in a lot of cases you might be over exaggerating the way in which you're perceived in the eyes of the people around you. I think if you are part of the 20% or so of non-Jews who live in Israel proper, right? Most of which is Arabic speaking. You would be conscious of the fact that you are an Arab. You are not Jewish. You grew up in your house speaking Arabic. Maybe by now you've mastered Hebrew and even speak it without an accent. Um, and maybe you are one of those people who actually wants to more and more integrate with the country, which this is never ever talked about. Huge numbers of Israeli citizens, Arabic-speaking Israeli citizens, are 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 very much doing in practice with their feet and with their lives the opposite of what people think they're doing. They're actually very closely connected with the state. They're part of Israeli society. They're seen as such. They're commentators on TV shows. They have their own radio stations. They have there's a whole ecosystem of Arabic Israel that nobody knows about, and they wouldn't if they're not there.
Hmm.
Lots of people take that track. They're like, I'm going to become more Italian. I'm going to just assimilate. And who knows, maybe in a couple generations, my kids will be indistinguishable. But lots of people don't feel that way. They feel like they're a non-entity. And and it's it's like in their daily life, they may, I will say this too as well. Like we in America have a hard time with this, but Israel, like the rest of the Near East, is very segregated, right? By and large, Arabs live in Arab towns, Jews live in Jewish towns, right? And it even gets more specific than that, right? Bedouin Arabs live in
Right.
Bedouin Arab town. I could go on and on. People self-select in the Middle East. It's very accepted and even like preferred. They look at our system and think, well, who are you guys? What do you stand for? You just all mix and match. It just doesn't matter where you come from or who your family is. And that from the outside looks bad from an American perspective. Like, well, wait, these Arabs are living in their own towns, and but that's kind of the way it works there. But it keeps that gap, that cultural gap,
Hmm.
intact, and sometimes for generations, right? So you'll meet an Israeli Jew, let's say living in Tel Aviv, super modern, right? Super Democrat, progressive even, right? Like more liberal than anybody we know, who's never actually sat down and had a coffee with an Arab, right? Even if they're like somehow like pro-Arab, they're just people don't meet each other as much, and that creates a lot of thoughts like, well, what do they think of me, and all of that. And of course, you do have those voices in Israel, and they've become louder, who are saying things that insinuate that Arabs are not quite, the equal to the rest of Israel. But if you look at it historically, and it's so important to look at this conflict not through a straw, right, and actually look at the long sweep of this, that's just not the default for most Israeli Jews. Most Israeli Jews are fascinated by Arabs, by Arab culture. It's interesting. There was a in the course of the last, I don't know, 5 years, there is an Alawite village in the extreme north of Israel that has now basically been it kind of straddles the border, and it's now part of it's now kind of under Israeli control. And as soon as it was possible, you had Israeli Jews just flocking up there to figure out, like, who are these people? What's their culture? What's their food? What do they believe? And that curiosity to me is much more the default than not. But if you're an Israeli Arab, there is a feeling that, okay, to really be part of this state, I need to learn Hebrew. For
Right.
some of them and a growing number of Christians, I should probably join the army, right? Because when I go to interview for a job, they'll ask me like, "Did you serve or did you do national service, the non-military equivalent, and where did you do it?" And if you're not doing those things, you're outside the mainstream, and that could be very isolating. So there's it's partially true and partially not, I would say.
Yeah, and what about things like I'm thinking also things just like traveling between the West Bank and or at the airport, trying to travel out of the country. I've heard Palestinian Israelis talk about it's way more difficult, and there are like structural issues that they have to face that nobody else has to.
In the West Bank, definitely, right? Getting around in the West Bank is a challenge. It's this weird gray zone overlapping legal and military jurisdictions. It's a boondoggle, no doubt.
Mm.
If you live in the West Bank, again, I always try to isolate. That is a different. It's like a different set of rules, and we may hate that, but it is. It's you can't conflate
Hmm.
what's the situation in the West Bank with what's happening in like the rest of the whole land. At the airport, yeah. Like, I'll tell you from my own experience, this is, me not being anywhere close to being Palestinian or Arab for a long time because I've traveled, like I said, across the Middle East, and before I had multiple passports, I had stamps in my passport from Iraq or, Lebanon. Let's just say that I was detained for hours. No matter how many times I went to Israel, I was, put in that little room while they, whatever they did, ran down my background or whatever, answered questions. So I'm certain that if you are, especially a Palestinian Arab and not an Israeli Arab, that you're getting that and more, right? If you're
Right.
an Israeli Arab, probably also, right? And not even probably. I know that that's true. So you have to ask yourself again, and I'm not going to go off on this again, but was this something Israelis invented because they have some kind of problem with Arabs? Or was there some kind of rationale for doing so that had to do with national security? Well, I'm sure you know what my answer to that would be. People say maybe it goes too far, it's too intrusive. I don't know, maybe, but these things did not emerge in a vacuum, right? I don't
Mhm.
think Israelis are interested in spending more resources to check into the background of people of Arab descent. I just don't think that's true. The fact of the
Mm.
matter is, when Israelis die in political violence, the person who kills them is often an Arab. It's an objective fact, and
Yeah.
Israelis know that, and they've built a system that that sort of screens for that. It's a hard truth, and I don't know enough details to know if it's too far or not far enough. I can understand how if they even feel a piece of what I'm feeling, and I'm sure they feel more. An Israeli Arab at the airport would say, "What the heck? I'm a citizen here. Why why
Mhm.
why are you putting me in this room? Like I've been living here my whole life."
Yeah. And I've been strip searched at the airport before, and I've sat through very long interrogations. I don't know what the right word for it is. So, yeah, it is a lot, and,
It's a
but
lot.
yeah, I've often felt like, yeah, there's probably a good reason why they're going hard this time, and last time they just kinda waved me through, right? Um,
I will say there's another. This is not close to being the same thing, so I don't want to equate it. But just to give you an example, but probably it's the reason you were stopped is that military age males, right, traveling alone, boom, you're going in the other line, and you're going to
mhm,
be painstakingly searched from top to bottom. And I'm mad every time. If you caught me in that moment, I'd be extremely anti-Israel. Pretty much every time. Kidding.
yeah,
But it's that like there's a reason military age males traveling alone tend to be sketchy,
yeah.
present company included.
Yeah, I was gonna say, that's a universal universal rule, we've all been there.
It is. We've all been
Um,
there.
I wanna end this conversation, thinking more about the book that they published, which again I think is worth looking at, and some of the things they were advocating, specifically from a Christian lens. So, why should Christians be interested in this area of the world, or should we? And then, what do you think are a fair spectrum of responses that Christians could have to what's going on in Israel and Palestine?
Yeah, that's the big question. I would say that for starters, as I said at the top, this is important. This concerns you, Christian, and it would behoove you to look a little more closely. Having said that, if you're going to look closely, look very closely.
Hmm.
Do not be satisfied with the slogans. Do not be satisfied with the potted history of the conflict. If you really want to acquit yourself like a Christian, like the Bereans, right, who search out the matter, in search of the truth, then search for truth. Like really dig in, read from multiple perspectives, and always be aware that I would say always be very humble. And that's what I think is missing from virtually all of the so-called Christian conversations on this topic. They tend to be bombastic. They tend to be very chauvinistic. They tend to be, my side is pure and perfect and has done no wrong, right? And to the extent we've done any wrong, it's because somebody else was really bad to us. Um, it tends to be very easy. It's not easy. This conflict is not easy. There's no quick answer. It's not like, if you just watch one more YouTube video, there's going to be, somebody telling you exactly what's going on and who's at fault and how to fix it. It's just, I've been in this conflict up and down, all around. I can tell you it's messy and tangled and ugly, and also, and this is where the humility comes in, it's it's deeply mysterious,
Hmm.
right? There are what I would say on this is all we have to do is look at scripture and look at the history of, redemption to know that there are things that happen in history whose purpose, whose place in the larger picture aren't disclosed for years, centuries afterward, right? There are deep and profound things that God is doing in this world that at the time make no sense. At the time provoke deep frustration and despair. And often for those Christians inclined to think that God's not in control or that we have to kind of grab the reins of history and kind of make it all do what it's supposed to do, it can lead to a lot of bad things, right? In the name of opposing bad nationalism, we embrace nationalism. The ugly side. I'm not an
Right.
anti-nationalist. Let me be clear, but humility diffuses all of that. I mean, anybody who's listening to this episode will be aware. I have very clear thoughts about this conflict, and we just scraped the surface. But I'm always aware that I don't know everything and that God is doing something unique here that has to do with the Jewish people. And because I am called by my Lord and by the Apostle Paul, among others, to care about this people, right? To see them as part of the story, to not just in a like meta historical sense, but as individuals, like actual human beings who find themselves caught up in this maelstrom. I think it's my duty to understand what their situation is, what they're thinking, what they're feeling. Also, to the extent that those feelings are entangled with the feelings of the people around them, be they Christian or non-Christian, I'm also obligated to find out what their story is, like what's going on over on that side, and doing it always with a little bit of tenuousness, a little bit of um, caution, right? Knowing that there are things that are objectively true, things that should be defended, right? But we're also human beings, right? And we're called to love other people, even when we disagree with them. And we're always supposed to believe that God is sovereign over all of this, right? And not get frustrated and start, blaming everybody, but ourselves, and be constructive. Like that's really what it comes down to. The best way to be constructive in this conflict is to know as much as possible, to hold it loosely, to be humble about it, and to try to whatever tiny, tiny extent you can to be constructive for the purpose of helping these two peoples to be closer to peace. And I think as Christians, and this is the part that a lot of Christians don't like to hear, whatever their political views are, we are a very small part of this conflict. If you just look at the raw data, this is a Jewish-Muslim conflict, right? Talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through the lens of Palestinian Christians is like talking about the America-Iraq War of 2003 through the lens of like American Episcopalians. I
Hmm.
think the percentages are about the same. Like it's a very small percentage. We care about them because we're Christians, as we should, but this is not a Christian conflict. Like in some ways, we don't have as much standing to sit there and adjudicate it and say who's right and who's wrong as we may think we are. I think we should be deeply humble and empathetic as basically Isaac and Ishmael, if I'm going to get really spiritual here, are working out something that I don't think any of us fully understand, and something that only God, whose outcome God fully knows. And I think that I'm not giving you, a lot of people are asking like, well, what do we do? What should we? I'm not giving you any of that. I'm giving you the posture that we need. And
Hmm.
I'm not saying I myself always live up to that, but that's the goal. That's the aspiration, is to be if you're gonna get into this, take it very, very, very seriously. Watch your words, right? Be um, be aware of your own biases. Be honest. Be intellectually honest about what's happening, and don't buy into these. There's so much, kind of social media hype and just all of this stuff. Be skeptical of all of it, and seek God. I really, I have this thing I always say about, and I'm really saying it to myself. All of us Christians in general, we spend a lot of time talking about God, not a
Hmm.
lot of time talking to Him. And I think that people who genuinely seek God, in prayer, repeatedly, frequently, on this topic will be guided into all truth. I believe
Hmm.
that. And even if we're catching it in glimpses and it's not all revealed at once, the spirit that God has toward the people caught up in this conflict will start to take root in our own hearts. And to me, that's the most important thing we can do. You and I on this podcast or anywhere else, Drew, are not going to do anything to change this conflict. Let's just be
Yeah.
honest. The best thing we can do is to be as Christian as possible as we talk about it.
Yeah. And I hear in that answer that kind of a blindly pro-Israel, Israel can do no wrong because they are God's people approach is just as unhelpful as the opposite.
I mean, look, all you have to do is read one page of the Bible to know that, the Hebrews are the first ones to tell you that we haven't done everything right. I mean, going all the way back to their holiest period. So I don't
Right.
think anybody in Israel, there's no Israeli Jew that's going to sit there and tell you that Israel's perfect, and nor do I. And I think that I understand why Christians take that approach, because so much of the world for so much of history has been stacked on the other side that there's kind of an overcorrection.
Mm.
And look, if you're going to overcorrect, I think, do what Jesus did. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." He wept for Jerusalem. Like, if you're going to overcorrect, I think that's probably the right way to go. But
Hmm.
we're all humans. Jews are not, like any better, right? There's a difference. I sometimes say too that, like, there's a difference between Christian Zionism, which is kind of what we're talking about, and Christian realism, and they both kind
Hmm.
of have to live in the same mind. And
Hmm.
it's okay to. The last thing I'll say, it's okay to not agree with an Israeli policy, right? The state of Israel is not holy, and nobody will be more honest about that than people running the state of Israel. It's not holy. It's not a holy thing. I
Right.
think it's important insofar as it provides the superstructure for the protection and the flourishing of the Jewish people. That's why I care about the state. But if you are going to criticize the state of Israel, do that carefully as well. Don't ascribe the crimes of some individual Israeli Jew in the West Bank to, like, the Jews or to Israel. That's the wrong way to do it. And even if you did do that, like, be empathetic. Like, try to weigh the scales in their favor. Maybe the Jews are not out to destroy everybody and to persecute Palestinians. It's possible. And try to get in their head and figure out, like, well, what is going on? I always say, if I saw critics of Israel, especially Christian critics, I like to, take my own people to task. If they were saying to me, "Look, I don't like what Israel did in Gaza. I don't like," but they were doing so with the spirit of humility and of concern and of care, genuine, like, okay, fine, I get it. Reasonable people can disagree. Let's look at the facts. Let's get a commission going or whatever. But it's so rare to find people so quick to criticize Israel, and I suppose it goes on the other side as well, who, like, have that posture I was talking about
Hmm.
before. And so if we can keep that, yeah, we could say that people go too far. I think that's okay. I mean, are we not human? We not sin? King David sinned. I do too. You know.
Hmm. Well, Robert Nicholson, your podcast is called Hebraica. There's quite a few episodes already out where you can listen to him talk more and in depth about these issues. Thank you so much for your wisdom and guidance on this.
Thank you, Drew. It's great to be here.
You've been listening to the Biblical Mind podcast, exploring the deep structures of Christian scripture. For more, visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org. Subscribe to this podcast at all the usual places so you never miss an episode.